watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture. Funding for Shalom TV has been provided by the following. And by viewers like you.
A New York Times Magazine cover story puts the Israeli-Iranian conflict front and center, as an Israeli journalist predicts that Israel will launch a military strike against Iran this year. And as the Republican Party works to find a candidate who can defeat Barack Obama, the issue of Israel keeps being raised. Would a Republican president change U.S. foreign policy regarding Israel? These issues and more will be addressed by our distinguished panel of commentators this week: Steven Bayme, director of the American Jewish Committee's Contemporary Jewish Life Department and its Koppelman Institute on American Jewish-Israeli Relations; Rabbi Julie Schonfeld, executive vice president of the conservative movement's Rabbinical Assembly, the international organization of conservative Masorti rabbis; Rabbi Steve Gutow, president and CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs and the past founding executive director of the National Jewish Democratic Council; and Kenneth Bialkin, chairman of the America-Israel Friendship League, a past chairman of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, and a current member of the board of directors of the Republican Jewish Coalition, all sharing opinion on this week's Roundtable. First, I thank all four of you, you're four of my favorite people, for joining us. Thank you very, very much. I want to begin by hearing your opinions on the New York Times Magazine cover story, which basically says, a piece by Ronan Bergman of the Yediot Achronot, who interviewed Ehud Barak on January 13th, 2012, the defense minister of Israel, and basically comes out saying that there is a strong possibility of an Israeli strike against Iran sometimes in 2012. None of us here are military experts. I'm not asking you should or should not Israel attack Iran. What I do want to hear from you is, what do you think this cover story on the New York Times Magazine does for Israel in the United States, and how do you think American Jews are going to react to it? Steve, I want to begin with you. What was your reaction when you saw the piece?
I thought it was a good recording of truth, possibility. I thought it brought Iran into the forefront as a reality, not just some sort of evil empire, but an empire that may well be attacked this year. It's not impossible. It's not a definite one way or the other, and I don't think the author meant it that way. But I think it's a real chance, and I think now Americans are going to be more aware of that possibility.
Steve, what was your reaction?
I had several reactions, Mark. One is it's very important that all options be on the table in any case. So if the New York Times tells us that all options are on the table, that certifies what I think many of us have been thinking anyway, and what we want to project. In other words, everyone should know that all options really are on the table. Number two is that my fear about American society at large has been a sort of, up until now, a sort of blasé attitude that, well, so what? Plenty of other countries have the bomb as well. This article centered the idea that this is a major existential threat. Thirdly, what I would have liked to have seen in the article, although it was at least alluded to at times, is that the Iranian bomb is not only a threat against Israel. It is a threat against the entire Middle East, and for that matter, a threat against the Western world.
And I'm sorry, do you feel that the piece made that point strongly enough?
Not as strongly as I would like. So in that respect, there's more to talk about. But in terms of understanding the issue, it at least placed stronger light upon the issue and inspired people like us to perhaps give added commentary to what it means.
Julie, what was your thought?
I was glad to see the piece on the front cover of the magazine. It has been very difficult to keep American attention focused on the threat of a nuclear Iran. It is, of course, always very difficult to keep people's attention on something that is such a high level of importance for such a long time. However, I would have also liked to see him focus a little bit more on the destabilization of the whole region through this possibility, and also to go into some greater detail on what would be the effects on deterrence and on decision-making by such a change.
Mm-hmm. Ken, your reaction?
Well, I have the privilege of not having read the article.
Okay.
But you read the review in the Times Book Review.
But I'm familiar with the story. We all are. We've lived with it now for several years. There are a few imperatives. Israel has said, we will not permit that to happen, that is, them to go live. And so you don't have to ask whether Israel would attack Iran. Israel has said, we will do anything we have to make sure that it doesn't happen, if, as and when, we're sure they're there. And so I have no doubt in my mind that Israel will certainly take whatever steps it has to take at that point in time when they can prevent it from happening, but not before. There is no other choice. They're using other choices now. We all know that directly or indirectly, Israel, aided and abetted certainly by the United States and others, whether by intelligence or by ordnance, has been practicing sabotage. Call it what you will, or assassination, whether it's the worm or whether it's the magnetic bombs. Somebody has been taking out Iranian scientists. It's no mystery where it's coming from. There's no confirmation. But if they weren't doing it, they should be court-martialed for not doing it. The question is whether the United States is serious. That is, United States...
What's your feeling here?
I do not believe that the United States has adequately expressed its intention and its view to be able to answer what will the United States do. How confident are we that the United States would employ force if it were necessary to do that? Because they've avoided saying that they would.
According to the article, there were 3 conditions which had to be met before Israel could really consider launching a strike. Number 1, they had to have the ability. Number 2, they had to have American support. And 3, all other possibilities had been exhausted. And the article suggests that those 3 situations, those 3 conditions now exist. Israel has the capability, Israel has a green light from America, and all of the diplomatic possibilities have been exhausted. What's your reaction to that?
It was not clear to me from the article that that was exactly what Barak was suggesting, that that all 3 of those conditions had been met in the way that you just suggested, Mark. I mean, look, I guess the question I'm asking myself is this group sitting around the table, not as part of the intelligence community,
Correct.
Not as part of the military strategic community. Speaking for myself, I'm a rabbi representing rabbis around the world. My expertise is in how to talk to our communities. My expertise is in how to help prepare our community. So it seems to me that what's on the table for the American Jewish community is to see ourselves as part of a world Jewish community. And similarly, for American Jews to see ourselves as part of the broader American people, and that these interests are aligned. So this is a situation that's unfolding. Looking back over any piece of military history, strategic history, there are always, hopefully, as was pointed out in the article, divergent views about strategy. Pity and fear the group that all thinks alike, and everybody knows exactly what to do all along. But rather the question for us is, how can we educate our own public, keep the attention of American leadership on the threat of Iran? What
do you think America's reaction would be if Israel did launch a strike?
America has made it very, very clear that this Iranian government is a major fundamental concern and enemy this government, of our country. And I think in doing that, it is probably predetermined American public opinion, depending on what exactly Israel may or may not do, but probably predetermined American public opinion and the American government's willingness to be at least tacitly supportive, if not actually supportive.
Jeffrey Goldberg was on Shalom TV and suggested that if Iran did develop a nuclear weapon, they in fact wouldn't use it, that they would use it as a psychological weapon, and they would blackmail both other Arab countries and hold in some way American foreign policy hostage, but they would not use a nuclear bomb. Do you think he's right or wrong?
Is he going to undertake that promise and
guarantee?
guarantee?
But even if he's...
And what portfolio does he hold?
But no, he has the right to an opinion.
Okay.
We all do. But on the other hand, it's a pretty powerful thing he just said. I mean, what he said was to give this particular Iran.
He was not suggesting they should get the bomb. He was only saying that if they did, he did not think they would use it.
Okay, and it's fine for him to think it, and he may well be right. I don't want to take anything away because it's obviously they haven't been a stupid regime in terms of that, as far as practically committing suicide. On the other hand, what kind of world will it be if this government of Iran has the power of a nuclear bomb, has the capacity to use it to move Hezbollah, it has the capacity to use it to get Saudi Arabia and other countries?
Steve is so right in what he says. And he shows the irresponsibility.
You mean Goldberg does?
No, Steve's comment
Yes.
shows the irresponsibility of a comment such as
Goldberg's
making it, because he ignores the fact that when Iran has it, what assurance, this is your point, does anybody have that somebody else isn't going to get it, that they're not going to give it to the Al-Qaeda, they're not going to give it to the Muslim Brotherhood, they're not going to give it to Mr. Terrorist down the street. Once you take that genie out of the bottle and put it in the hands where you can't control its currency, all other commentary is fatuous. Excuse me, Mr. Goldberg.
No, so well taken, Kenny. Look, I think it was Elie Wiesel put it very well many years ago at the height of the Cold War. I think it was 1981 when that television program, The Day After, which was about a putative nuclear attack, was shown. Wiesel, in the post, right after the film was shown, he commented that at the end of the day, America and the Soviet Union have actually acted responsibly in terms of their possession of nuclear weapons. He said, I can't be certain about anyone else. And this was obviously in the context of Iraq. Iran certainly falls under that category as well. So first of all, it's irresponsible to suggest, as Kenny just mentioned, that there's no possibility they're going to use it. They just might. And in that respect, there has to be concern. President Jimmy Carter gave an interview in Time magazine last week in which he said he wouldn't be concerned because he said, what's Iran going to do? They'll have 1 or 2 bombs and Israel will have 300. So why should we worry about it?
I was very upset by the comment.
Absolutely.
And I want our audience to know we called the Carter office.
Right.
And he refused to come on Shalom TV.
Yeah.
Now, he may have refused to come on because we're not big enough. But he also may have refused to come on because he didn't want to talk about it in public. It was a very upsetting thing for him to have said.
Yeah, for a former president of the United States, that's quite disturbing. But I think the real point is something else, is that introducing a bomb into Iran, you're now talking about a religious regime, a regime guided by religious leaders. And even President Carter said, the religious leaders of Iran have promised that they will not manufacture nuclear weapons, as if we're supposed to take their promises at face value. But once you're dealing with the elements of religion, and frankly, when it spills over into religious fanaticism, you have to take that possibility much more seriously. Then add to that all of Kenny's concerns about it falling into other hands, the use of nuclear diplomacy, if you will, as a vehicle of blackmail, and the end result is something we should all be very worried about. And in that respect, Obama did say quite well that America cannot stand by while Iran attains nuclear capacity.
Has there been an arc to the president's attitude towards Iran's getting a nuclear weapon? Do you feel in any way it's different now than it was when he assumed office?
No, I think he's woken up to reality. I mean, I think in the early debates, particularly with Hillary, he seemed to be much more, as many candidates tend to be, much more believing in sort of an ideal world, rather than when you get into that office, you have to face reality. I mean, you have to face what it really does require to defend this country and to be a leader in the world. And I think there's no doubt that the president has grown dramatically in that understanding. But I don't want to put this just on President Obama. This is going to be true of any president that comes into office. They're going to learn a lot. They're going to learn it right there, watching it and seeing it and feeling it. And they know things that they didn't know, and they know things that we don't know.
But he did shift from a language of engagement, which I was, again...
I think I just said that, by the way.
Well, the term itself, I think, is revealing. He shifted from a language of we can somehow persuade them to do the right thing to a language of resistance. And that, to me, is a real arc, yes.
Experience is the best teacher. On many points, without going into detail, he has different views today than he had 3 years ago or 4 years ago.
You're saying on many items.
On many items, and that's to be complimented for that.
One of the things that
An appropriate amount of time.
one of the things we lived through, I know I lived through it, and I think most of you are around my age, was when there was the threat of nuclear weapons coming in through the Soviet Union to Cuba. And America and the Kennedy administration said there will be no nuclear weapons in this hemisphere other than our own. When Americans hear that Venezuela could get a nuclear weapon from Iran, I believe it has a different power for the American people, who are very supportive of the state of Israel. We see that in poll after poll after poll. But it's one thing to care about the state of Israel. It's another thing to worry that there is going to be some crazy South American dictator who would have a nuclear weapon because of Iran.
The premises of our discussion seem to me perhaps a bit too optimistic, I'm sorry to say, right? Even a definitive action, could delay the acquisition of a nuclear weapon, but there's not clear indication that it could actually deter in any long-term sense the acquisition of a nuclear weapon.
Yes, and that point is also made in the article. You're exactly right. All right, before we take a quick break, so I'm going to ask you your best guess. Will Israel attack Iran in 2012?
No.
Will Israel attack Iran in 2012?
I don't think so.
Will Israel attack Iran in 2012?
I don't serve the community by guessing or pontificating.
No guess at all. What's your sense?
As a professor, I learned a long time ago, in the classroom, when someone asks you a question and you don't know the answer, say you don't know the answer. I honestly don't know.
And you have no feel one way or the other?
I don't know.
I have to say, my sense is it will not happen. And I think in some way, there is going to be enough pressure put, or maybe enough done in what you called sabotage earlier in our discussion, that it simply will delay and delay and delay. I believe that we'll be meeting in 2013, and Israel will not have attacked. And I also have been persuaded by many that it's very hard for Israel to do in Iran, what they did to the Iraqi nuclear reactor, or what they did to the early stages of the Syrians' development of a nuclear weapon. And that there's just, the question is how even realistic it is.
What is clear now is that Israel, whoever is deciding, feels this is a serious threat.
Yes.
And that sanctions will not work because Iran has demonstrated there is no sanction, no other diplomatic effort that will discourage them, that they will continue on that course. Maybe they'll stop, maybe they'll pause, but they'll start again. They have an objective. And Israel is, I think, properly skeptical of the efforts that have gone on so far to convince Iran that we're serious. And that's why I say I don't think they'll do it, because we'll go through some more period of increasing the pressure. But I don't believe there's any pressure likely that will stop Iran from doing what they think is their destiny.
To what extent do you really worry, Stephen, that Iran will get a nuclear weapon?
I certainly worry deeply and emotionally simply because I don't trust them, as far as I can throw a ball once they have it. In that respect, all the statements that have been made about the Iranians having a bomb is intolerable for the region, for the West, and obviously for Israel. Yes, all those things compel me.
And you really feel it's enough of a real possibility that it gives you serious concern?
Keeps me up at night, absolutely.
How much do you think, to what extent do you think it's so much of a possible reality that it really gives you constant worry?
I truly, truly worry about it every day.
For you?
Agree. Worry about it every day, along with how much more unstable the region has become as a whole, even over the last 12 to 18 months.
The one thing
I don't worry about things over which I have no control.
That's your philosophy of life.
Well, I hope it should be, but I do feel that if it should come to that, it would be tragic. That is to say, if Israel is forced, if they decide they must do it, and I think they will come to a decision and do it if they must reluctantly, because the difficulty of mounting any kind of frontal attack, if it has to be conventional and if it has to be using the ordnance, will strip Israel of all of its armament, all of its air force, all of its missiles. I mean, the effort, if it had to do it alone, would be tragic in terms of blood and treasure, and I pray that it would not have to be done. And that's why I say America has to be clearer now, sooner, and more definitive. And let us know whether they're milchach or fleischach, whether they're with us or against us on this, because it's a very important point. If America were as firm as Israel in what its intended status would be and would say so, then I think the political equation would be different. And if other countries would line up and instead of talking about the effect of sanctions, however intensive they may be, when we also have proof already that sanctions, if they're purely economic, will not alone do it, I think we're kicking the can down the road.
I think perhaps one side of it that, if one wants to be optimistic, there is a theme here that should be underscored, is that obviously I have no brief for the mullahs and the rulers of Iran, but everything I've read and heard about them is that they are concerned about what their image is abroad, and they are concerned about practical matters like sanctions. So in that respect, before we assume that nothing else can work, one can at least have some glimmer of hope, if you will, that pragmatism will rule the day. And under those circumstances, the kind of tragic scenario that Ken lays out hopefully will not happen.
And why do you think Ehud Barak granted Bergman the interview?
I think he was communicating a message that all options are on the table. And
who was he communicating to?
To both American public opinion and international public opinion.
When we come back, I want to talk, in some way it's a related issue, about some of the things that have come out of the Republican primary debates, and we'll continue in just a moment.
Well, the reason that there's not peace between the Palestinians and Israel is because there is in the leadership of the Palestinian people are Hamas and others who think like Hamas, who have as their intent the elimination of Israel. And whether it's in school books that teach how to kill Jews, or whether it's in the political discourse that is spoken either from Fatah or from Hamas, there is a belief that the Jewish people do not have a right to have a Jewish state. There are some people who say, should we have a two-state solution? And the Israelis would be happy to have a two-state solution. It's the Palestinians who don't want a two-state solution. They want to eliminate the state of Israel. And I believe America must say, and the best way to have peace in the Middle East is not for us to vacillate and to appease, but is to say we stand with our friend Israel. We are committed to a Jewish state in Israel. We will not have an inch of difference between ourselves and our ally Israel. This president went before the United Nations and castigated Israel for building settlements. He said nothing about thousands of rockets being rained in on Israel from the Gaza Strip. This president threw... I think he threw Israel under the bus with regards to defining the 67 borders as a starting point of negotiations. I think he disrespected Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Bibi Netanyahu. I think he has time and time again shown distance from Israel, and that has created, in my view, a greater sense of aggression on the part of the Palestinians. I will stand with our friend Israel.
Thank you, Governor. Speaker Gingrich, you got into a little hot water when you said the Palestinians were an invented people.
It was technically an invention in the late 1970s, and it was clearly so. Prior to that, they were Arabs. Many of them were either Syrian, Lebanese, or Egyptian, or Jordanian. There are a couple simple things here. There were 11 rockets fired into Israel in November. Now imagine in Duval County that 11 rockets hit from your neighbor. How many of you would be for a peace process? And how many of you would say, you know, that looks like an act of war? You have leadership unequivocally, and Governor Romney's exactly right. The leadership of Hamas says not a single Jew will remain. Well, you're not having a peace negotiation then. This is war by another form. My goal for the Palestinian people would be to live in peace, to live in prosperity, to have the dignity of a state, to have freedom, and they can achieve it any morning they are prepared to say Israel has a right to exist, we give up the right to return, and we recognize that we're going to live side by side. Now let's work together to create mutual prosperity, and you could in 5 years dramatically improve the quality of life of every Palestinian, but the political leadership would never tolerate that, and that's why we are in a continuous state of war where Obama undermines the Israelis. On the first day that I'm president, if I do become president, I will sign an executive order directing the State Department to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem to send the signal with Israel. We're back, and I want to talk now about issues that have been raised out of the Republican debates. I don't know how many of you are watching them vociferously or carefully. I'm a political junkie. I watch them all. And it is clear that time and time again, the issue of Israel is raised by people on stage. And we just showed our audience one of those moments when different members of the on stage did speak about Israel. But my question for you is, number one, as you have heard it, as you've heard the discussion of Israel emerge, anything about it surprise you? And in general, has it been good or bad for the state of Israel? And the one comment that is mentioned over and over again is Newt Gingrich's comment that the Palestinians are an invented people. And the question becomes, to what extent has that been helpful or hurtful to the state of Israel? And to what extent was a statement like that appropriate to be made in the midst of a presidential debate?
Most important thing to realize, I think most important for our constituencies, for the viewership to realize, is that the great thing about American-Israel relations, really going back since the Johnson administration, if not before, is that support for Israel has been bipartisan. And in that respect, I think the most important thing American Jewry has done has been to indicate that our support for Israel is one that transcends party politics, whether in Jerusalem or here in Washington. So that has come through in the debates, and I've been very satisfied with that, been very happy about that. As far as the issue about the invented narrative, I know, I was about to say Professor Gingrich, Speaker Gingrich, likes to fancy himself as an historian, and there is some measure of truth in terms of historical truth to that comment. However, its political ramifications and its political impact are not constructive at present for one simple reason. Israel, again, both the Likud party and the Labour Party are committed to a two-state solution, and the Kadima party. A two-state solution means a Palestinian state. Someone like myself believes, and I think, again, Israeli leadership has pretty much said this, is that a Palestinian state is an essential to Israel's future as a Jewish state, if nothing else for demographic reasons. So in that respect, the statement being made at the RJC or elsewhere, I think it fed upon certain emotions within the Jewish community that, again, they are not unrooted in history. They have a certain basis to them, but they lead one to the conclusion of forget about a Palestinian state. It's just an invented narrative to begin with. I don't regard that as terribly helpful. It certainly is not helpful in terms of the practical politics of can we still get to a two-state solution. Remember, the alternative to a two-state solution is Tony Judd's one-state solution, and that'd be a disaster for Israel.
Steve?
I'll first speak a little bit about the narrative. I think it was not helpful, and I think it's part of a political concept that's pretty new, actually, in this part of the of our period in American history that needs to be stopped in general, because there's a lack of often thoughtfulness and civility, even among, I mean, I'm not suggesting there not be a sense of passion, Mark, and belief in terms of policy specifically, but when one starts telling somebody that they say they also support them having a state, that you're not a people, it's going to be pretty hard when that person becomes president for him to actually talk to those people and move them forward. And I think the example that comes back into my mind is possibly one of the low points in my, and I, as you know, I was the AIPAC regional director in the Southwest and started that region. And I always believed in the bipartisan support of Israel, and I always believed in it so completely that many, because as you said, I started the National Jewish Democratic Council. Many of the Republican Congress members actually could not even believe I was a Democrat in the final analysis. But back when Secretary Baker and George Bush said some pretty ludicrous things when a lot of us came to argue about loan guarantees. There was not that kind of visceral attack in making Israel into a wedge issue. I mean, it just wasn't what happened. And I think it's incumbent on those who have influence in either party or both parties, and I think many responsible Jews and pro-Israel people are, to say, talk about policy, argue about policy, argue about you think the settlements are fine, that's fine, say it. But don't do it in such a visceral way that Israel becomes something that the American electorate has to look at as this wedge issue in which they're making decisions. It's a mistake for those of us who believe and care deeply about the state of Israel. It's a mistake.
Mm-hmm. There was a suggestion, actually was made by Governor Perry, that if he were elected president, if there were a Republican president, the whole issue of how foreign aid is distributed would be rethought, and that one of the things to cut this burgeoning debt deficit would be that each year every country would have to come and make its case all over again in the issues of foreign aid, including the state of Israel. And when he was challenged by that on stage, his answer was, well, of course we're going to give Israel its money, but that still even Israel should have to start at zero each year and prove that it needs and merits American financial aid. And I was surprised that there was not more made of that comment. And for people like yourself, who are very committed to the state of Israel, I have not heard committed Republican Jews express a certain kind of discomfort with that kind of statement. And I wondered if you heard it and whether it mattered to you at all.
I've heard all of them. And I agree with Steve that there's been too much rancor and too much avarice even in the debate, and I'm sorry for that. And the fault lies everywhere, and I think everybody will have a price to pay for doing that. But I was there when Gingrich said that. It was a passing phrase, and what he said had nothing to do with a Palestinian state, and he made it very clear immediately after that and many times after that he wasn't saying he's against the Palestinian state. He wasn't against the fact that the people living there have a legitimate right to get together and to try to coalesce into it, and he falls into the line. What he did say, as you say, there is an historic basis for saying that in history there never was a Palestine, there never were a Palestinian people, they never had a government, they never, and in fact, when we talked about Palestine when I was growing up, it was the blue box and the pushkit home.
The Jews were the Palestinians.
And we were the Jews, we were the Palestinians. And so he's technically, as you say, there's a basis for saying that there never was a Palestine, and that's all he said. It was an historical footnote. It had nothing to do with his position on whether the people who are now trying to make a country. And he said, I believe in a two-state
Yes, he did,
solution,
by
and
the way.
we all do. And so let's not put it out of context.
I want to quote something he said in 2005. The Palestinian diaspora should invest in their ancestral lands, and Gingrich urged Congress to establish a program of economic aid for the Palestinians to match the aid of the U.S. government that the U.S. government provides Israel. The Palestinians were, he said, among the most international and most advanced people in the Arab world, and Gingrich wrote while a fellow at the right-wing American Enterprise Institute. So it did not sound then like he was as concerned with saying the Palestinians were invented people as he is now.
A different subject.
Different. Not exactly. Not exactly.
Well,
Do you feel at all that there would be a difference whether there were a Republican or a Democratic president in the White House vis-a-vis American foreign policy?
It's very important to amplify things that were said before. Israel's support is a bipartisan issue. We support Israel as Americans. We support it because it is our sister democracy in the region. We support it because our interests are more than wholly aligned. Our values are more than wholly aligned. We, as an American Jewish community, in our sense of urgency to ensure and sustain America's support of Israel, do ourselves no favors if we allow the rhetoric, or we in any way encourage or participate in the rhetoric around Israel to become anything other than consistent, reasoned. We don't want to allow ourselves to become a political football, because there's a campaign and there's a morning after a campaign. There's an election and there's a morning after an election. And the issues that we are talking about here, the crucial issues about Iran, about the negotiation of a two-state solution, those are going on today. They are going on during a campaign, and history and time will march on. And we are involved in a very significant and very effective partnership with the government of the United States. We brought up the president's speech at the UN, the work of Ambassador Susan Rice at the UN, tremendous and significant efforts that are going on. And I see that we do ourselves no favors if we become overly invested, right, as a wedge issue in this election.
I only want to point out this to all of you, and I'm not saying something you don't know. There is within the Jewish community today an element that vilifies Barack Obama, that basically describes him almost as somebody who is anti-Israel. And that perspective is
Publisher
pushing,
of the Atlanta Jewish Times.
yes, is pushing very hard for a Republican to be elected by appealing to a segment of the Jewish community on the grounds that if the United States deals with President Obama for another 4 years, it will be disastrous for Israel. And so, although everybody at this table understands how historically bipartisan the support has been for Israel, there is an element within our community that wants to make it seem as if the current administration is anti-Israel.
Well,
and,
look,
and this is not something that's new to you.
Come on, you're not a kid. I mean, every community has striations of opinion.
And
it
this
runs
only
from left. It
and
runs
this
from
only on the. Do you believe that those who say this are only on the far fringe of the Jewish community?
I think if you look at the polls and you look at the statistics right now, it's nice to say that we're a homogeneous Jewish community. We are not. There are different opinions about Israel, about every issue in Jewish life. It may range from a margin of 10% to 20 to 50%, but there are differences, and we should not paper over them. We should look at them and examine them. But we shouldn't condemn. If there are people who feel that the president is a threat to Israel's safety, they should vote against him. I don't think most people would raise it to that level. But you cannot say that the policies and the positions will be the same no matter who is elected. There will be differences. Israel is not a central issue in the national elections today. There are more important issues. And so I do not think that that issue is going to come up. Even in the Jewish community, there are different opinions on all of these issues. But by and large, if you look at the statistic, in the Republican Party, support for Israel was measurably higher than in the Democratic Party.
Yes, sir.
Go and look at the numbers. So let's not paper it over. There will be a difference. Will it be a disaster? No. There are safeguards? Yes. Will it be different? Yes. What will the differences be? I can't tell you. But I know how I would feel.
There's a certain
Would
contradiction.
that make me decide on who to vote for? Not necessarily, because I don't think it would be more important, perhaps, than my view on the economic, my view on what happens on issues of such as deficit control. There are people who think more issues, and you have to pick your issue. I don't think Israel is a big issue anywhere right now.
Julie?
I just don't want to let the comment sit that there is more support for Israel in the Republican Party than in the Democratic Party. I think, frankly, that goes against the rest of your comment.
That's just a factual question. I'm not advocating either way.
I don't actually accept it as a factual statement, because I think that there are differences of opinion as to how to achieve certain goals, just as there are differences of opinion among the Israeli people about how to achieve the agreed upon goal of the government of the State of Israel, which is a negotiated two-state solution. But to say that there is not support or insufficient support or substantially less support in the Democratic Party overall for the State of Israel, I think, it casts that in far too black and white.
I don't want to quibble over numbers, but those are the numbers. Look at them.
Yeah, the surveys do bear out what Kenny's referring to. In other words, that if you ask simple polling questions, the support for Israel among Republicans is higher than support for Israel among Democrats. Let me just finish for a second. The context, though, I still think is important here. 97% of the pro-Israel support in this country does not come from Jews. It comes from Gentiles. That's a comment about America and about American fairness towards Israel and towards Jews. I happen to think that's the core of the special relationship between America and Israel. It's one of the reasons I tend to think the support for Israel has been and will continue to be bipartisan. But in terms of the actual demographics of American society right now, do bear in mind that there are sectors of the population that are more pro-Israel, and there are sectors of the population that are less so.
So is this a pro-Israel statement then? You started with the Newt Gingrich quote, right? Is that because, and again, that these are very, forgive me, but shallow ways in which to characterize this, because is it supportive of Israel to question the nature of the Palestinian people, the legitimacy of the Palestinian people? Some would beg to differ.
No, and as I said before, I thought it was not helpful, and I think that's probably one of
What's not helpful?
that statement. I mean, no matter
The Gingrich statement.
I'm not saying whether it's helpful or not. I'm just trying to put it in
But I think it's
context.
important to note that it is not helpful,
Okay.
because that's what I'm saying. But what I want to say is something a little different, and I want to sort of it doesn't actually. I mean, in some ways, if you say that the support, and I think you're right in terms of polls, in the Democratic Party is somewhat less. It's still overwhelmingly pro-Israel, but it's somewhat less than the Republicans, and I agree with that. I think what's most important is those people that live in this broad center, which we have to keep alive, must stand up very clearly when we see this kind of demagogic, outrageous rhetoric, and say it's not okay. It's not okay. If we don't stand up and say it, in fact, we have to say it to our own people. Like if I hear people that are in my particular world speaking about either party in a certain way, I'm going to say to them, and I have people in both parties, I'm going to say that's not the way to talk. You can argue about a policy, but don't start saying this candidate or that candidate is the devil incarnate and is going to destroy it. Because if we don't have the guts to stand up and take on our own side when they walk across that line of civility or decency, and I agree with you, passion about issues matter.
I agree with what you're saying.
I just want to know from the four of you, and our viewers watch all the time, Shalom TV covers all kinds of events. To what extent, when we cover a Zionist Organization of America dinner, are we looking at something that represents a piece of mainstream American Jewish life?
It certainly represents a sector within the Jewish community. Look, ZOA is pretty much indistinguishable, say, from the National Council of Young Israel. in terms of their politics. National Council of Israel is a very important synagogal movement. It doesn't represent all of American Orthodoxy, but it represents a sizable percentage. So the membership of the ZOA may be small, but certainly the opinions it articulates are by no means fringe opinions within the Jewish community. I feel very differently, for example, though, say about the Atlanta Jewish Times piece, which I thought was a crazy piece.
And he had to resign.
And he did resign, absolutely, and that was the right thing to do.
Or about the Orthodox outrage
only because you've mentioned, we do have to clarify.
Yes.
There was a suggestion, it's not clear how serious he was, but he had to resign over it because he suggested that one option is that Barack Obama be assassinated.
The man's an idiot.
Yeah, I mean, it was just, it's so ludicrous system. But the reason I asked you is that I get emails from people who say to me, the ZOA is only a New York-based operation. It is on the far right. It does not represent any mainstream movement in the Jewish community. And that ultimately it is a far right, Republican-oriented organization which is virulently anti-Obama, and that it should not be seen as a representation of a major thrust of American Jewish life. And I want to know the extent to which you feel that that is true or not true.
I think it is quite extreme. I think it is quite far right-wing. Its politics are very far from my own politics. The politics are very far from that of the Jewish establishment more generally. But as I say, it does represent sizable sectors within the community, particularly within the Orthodox community, although I assume not exclusively because the ZOA itself is not Orthodox. And therefore, I would find it hard to accept the hypothesis of don't listen to them at all because they're the equivalent, say, of some fanatic elsewhere. No, they represent a sizable sector of the community.
The Zionist Organization of America is an honorable, historically respected group which represents a point of view that has to be considered because they are not irrelevant. Now, you have to distinguish some of the policies that have been expressed from the manner in which some of them have been expressed. Some of the people advocate things and say extreme things for which they may be speaking for themselves. But in terms of the geopolitical positions that they have, I think you'll find a very large swath of support for that in the Jewish community. Far left, far right, we have both. That is clearly in the right spectrum. But to suggest, as you do, that they're a threat, they're not a threat to anybody. They're a legitimate expression of a point of view that you may not agree with. But you say it in such a disapproving way that I think I have to defend them. Some of my best friends are Zionists.
By the way, I've said this repeatedly. I happen to think Mort Klein is a very important person, and I have great affection for him. I was not making any personal statement of my own at all. The only reason why I bring it up was I didn't want our viewers to think that at this table I'm sitting with four people who believe that basically the American Jewish community is monolithic about saying the government is bipartisan and it doesn't matter who becomes president. Because I run into Jews all the time who feel that this presidential election is crucial for the future of the state of Israel because there are very big differences in Jews' minds between a Barack Obama or a Mitt Romney or a Newt Gingrich or a Republican approach and a Democratic approach. And at this table, I didn't feel that was being expressed. The place it's expressed is you go to a ZOA dinner and you hear a perspective where it would be a catastrophe if President Obama is reelected. And from that perspective, I did want our audience to understand that you four may feel at the moment that basically the Jewish community is all together and that it really doesn't matter who becomes president.
Nobody
but there are segments. You never said it doesn't matter.
There are segments of this community for who this is a passionate issue of disagreement.
When we hear people say things that are beyond the ken and beyond the pale of civilized conversation, I think we have a duty to stand up and say, that's not okay. And I don't think we do it enough. I mean, I hope we do it more and more.
Generally speaking, there is a consensus On the one hand, that the political culture, unfortunately, has fallen into an incivility. If you're talking about the presidential election, probably in my memory, I can't recall a presidential election where people were so either for or against, particular candidates. In other words, there is a certain polarization, and that certainly saddens me. And yes, that needs to be countered with a sense of. I think what's been around this table is a sense of we're all in the same. We're all in the same overall program with differences of nuances, right of center, left of center, but the broad center is still there. That does not mean the polarization is not taking place. But in terms of how the Jewish community and its leadership position themselves, I think the position here has been quite responsible, namely that we can work with members of both parties. The support for Israel is a bipartisan issue, and we've strived very hard to keep it that way. The area that most concerns me, actually, which we haven't spoken about, is to what extent is the Walt Mearsheimer view of American foreign policy been hijacked by pro-Israel advocates in this country. That view has not entered into the political discourse as yet. In other words, you're running for office, you're not going to cite Walt Mearsheimer. But underneath the scene, I think there is strong opinion expressed in certain circles, both on the right and on the left, that the support for Israel being given to America by America is not in America's interest. That, I think, is really what we have to worry about most. The incivility, I share your concerns, but in terms of where America's heading, right now the bipartisan view continues. I hope it will continue, and we need to be concerned about those people.
And all I was saying was we have to be able to stand up when we see things, ads that are running in Pennsylvania that are hugely attacking one party or another, ads that are running in some of the more left-wing Jewish groups that are blog entries that actually take on the Republican candidates in such a way as that it borders on outrageous. And I don't think, and I'll repeat it, I don't think, and I don't have I can't give you chapter and verse, but I think we all know that happens. I don't think we do it enough, and I don't think we steel ourselves. As much as we should passionately support our own views and passionately be there, we also should passionately care about the nature of discourse.
I want to say, by the way, you deserve credit because you've been saying this in the broader Jewish context.
1000%.
And your attempt to create a new kind of Jewish civility is one of the great contributions both you and JCPA have made, so you deserve credit for that. I'll give you one example of something that's said, and then just react to this. Newt Gingrich gets up and says, if I am president, the first day in office, I'm going to move the American embassy to Jerusalem. And there are Jews all the time who will say to me, Barack Obama came to AIPAC, he said he was going to move the embassy to Jerusalem, and the next day he took it back. And the difference between the Republicans and the Democrats is Obama will never move the embassy to Jerusalem because he doesn't want to offend the Palestinians. And the Republicans say if there were a Republican president, the Republican president would move the embassy to Jerusalem because the Republican president is, in fact, devoted to the state of Israel in a way that Democrats are not. And that is something you hear everywhere you go. And I wanted
How do they view the 8 years of the Bush administration?
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. And Bo, it doesn't matter that Ehud Barak gets up and says there has never been an American administration as supportive of the state of Israel, including the Bush administration, as the Obama administration. And I hear American Jews who just don't care about the facts.
Talking about the military,
they only
the military
care
and
about the
intelligence
rhetoric.
cooperation. That's all he's talking about.
Well, how is that at all? Right, if one of our primary issues
but
is
I'm
the
just
security of the state
narrowing
of
what
Israel,
you said.
military and intelligence cooperation, to say that this is the strongest relationship that he's seen is quite a significant endorsement and goes quite against the public opinion and quite against the statement that, if I just may finish, and quite against the statement that you expressed that, Republicans are more supportive of Israel than Democrats. If that is the case, how do we come to have a Democratic administration thus characterized by Ehud Barak?
Because there are differences in views, and people should vote for those differences, and we'll see what happens. But we should not cover over the fact that there are differences. They may not be big, they may not be important, they may not be lethal, but there are differences.
That is
and
correct.
there is no doubt that whoever is elected, there will be a different gestalt. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Not at all.
Many people would prefer that, and some people wouldn't.
Well, yes,
but it's not a threat.
It's easy to revert back to what have come to be sort of known truths. That the Republican Party views Israel one way, the Democrats another way, that those who criticize the administration, those then come to be accepted as truths. And yet, even in this very conversation, right, we reveal significant facts that at the very least call into question the veracity of those assumed truths. Now, whether or not they come to be proven, fine, let them be proven. But what we need to be doing is to be having a more significant discussion about issues, about actual processes taking place, whether those are taking place in the UN or whether they are taking place elsewhere, and not resort and revert to these kind of absolutes about what we assume to be true of the parties, because those are public relations campaigns.
We follow what's going on carefully, and we see where Israel and where the Jewish people are and what's happening in the world. We see the wars going on, and there are dangers out there. I believe that the attitudes toward Israel, as evidenced in the United Nations and elsewhere, are not grounded solely on geopolitical and historical reasons, but they reflect a latent and not so latent anti-Semitism, which is creeping throughout the Arab world. They're successors to the part of the Christian world that used to be the home of anti-Semitism. But Arab anti-Semitism today is flagrant, open, continuous, and deadly. It's evidenced by the so-called BDS. You all know what I mean by the BDS. It's evidenced by the delegitimization effort. It's evidenced by the speeches that are made. There is no pretense about it. They hate it. They hate Israel. They hate Jews, and there's anti-Semitism out there, and it's growing worse and bigger and more worrisome, and we should not ignore it.
The comment about anti-Semitism is quite real, and I don't think we've fully woken up to the sense of newness here. We have assumed that the Arab-Israeli conflict was a political conflict that could be resolved by political measures and political compromises. What we've learned, especially since the collapse of Oslo, is that the rejection of Israel's right to exist is much more deeply rooted than any of us imagined. And that is rooted in some very deep-seated anti-Semitism, including things like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the blood libel. All those things have really surprised us over the last 10 years. So I think Ken's comment is very well taken.
I can't thank the four of you enough. I love sitting with you. I could just listen to you talk all day. And it's so kind that you give this kind of insight to our viewers. Julie and Stephen and Steve and Ken, thank you so much. You have to continue, come back. We'll talk more about anti-Semitism and the issues that there are a whole lot of other things that I want to talk about, but we'll get to all of it. But thank you for coming. And those were the thoughts of Steven Bayme, Julie Schonfeld, Steve Gutow, and Kenneth Bialkin. I hope you enjoyed hearing what they had to say. As always, I invite you to be in touch with us with any thoughts or comments you may have to the ideas expressed here. Please be in touch with me this week. Email me, write me, post on our Facebook wall, or tweet me. I look forward to hearing from you. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM. To GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.